Because it's already 3:32.
Beautiful. All right. I know there are technical difficulties that are happening, and there are a lot of Carees and K. Chase Pattersons, and that is fitting for us because we wanted to do this presentation for a lot of Carees and a lot of K. Chase Pattersons. And so it's good to see all of you Carees and K. Chase Pattersons and everyone else who is in the other room. I'm a little afraid to look at all the participants and hit different things because I think I'm going to mess up something online. And so therefore I'm not going to do that, but I am going to introduce myself. My name is not Hove, but every time you say that line, I feel like you have to say my name is Hove. My name is Sundiata Salaam. I am the Chief People Officer at Freedom Prep Academy, which is a pre-K through 12 charter school in Memphis, Tennessee. And my colleague is...
Hello, everybody. I'm Mike Brown. I'm the Executive Director of the Freedom Fellows Institute at Freedom Prep Academy in Memphis, Tennessee, and it's great to be with you guys.
And we know that, a lot of you all are coming for PD, and so we are going to jump right in. It's already at 2:34, and we don't want to waste people's time past that 3:30 time. Excuse me, it's 3:30 where you all are. It's 2:30 where we are. So we don't want to waste your time past 4:30. And we know also after 4:30, after 4:35 can be the witching hour for kids who are ready for you to get off the computer. My child might come in here. If he does, forgive me. And forgive him for whatever he does, but that may happen in a few minutes. And so we're going to jump right in. The presentation, what we're doing is called culture killing. And when we're talking about culture killing, we're specifically, of course, we're educators. We're talking about the killing of culture in the curriculum and the way that happens in ways that are very outward and ways that may be a little bit more subtle. And every time we do this presentation, this picture always comes up. And there may be some of you who are on that have seen a lot of this. If you have, I need you to act just as excited as if it's the first time that you've seen it and not ruin it for anyone else who hasn't seen it. And also pay close attention because there will be some things that may be a little different as well. But every time we do this presentation, and I look at this picture and I think about the natives in this country, the natives who were in the United States of America, as well as the natives who were in Canada, and the culture and the things that they had. And even looking at this picture, I think about all the clothing they have, the feathers, and how all of those things had particular symbolic meaning to them and all the things that it meant. And then they were introduced to Carlisle schools. And then they were introduced to these things called Indian schools. And they were taught in these schools, according to the people who were running them, how to be civilized, right? And the civilization of these people, and I'm saying civilization very tongue-in-cheek. I'm saying civilization in the sense that this is not actually the process that was happening, right? The so-called civilization of these people led to this. We went from having a understanding or having a sort of heritage that was true to these people to moving to this, the cutting off of their hair, the shifting of the way that they looked and the way that they saw the world. And there was a General Pratt, I believe his name was, who mentioned the famous quote, "Kill the Indian, save the man." Kill the Indian, save the man. And, at their time period, they actually thought they were being progressive. Some of them even said things like, at least we're not actually physically killing them. We're actually trying to transform them. We're actually trying to make them better from the conditions in which they came. Something that sounds familiar to some of the language we sometimes use in education, right? They thought they were doing something progressive by changing these people to this. And we bring this up because when it comes to education, when it comes to schooling, there is no such thing as neutral schooling. It used to drive me crazy when we got in schooling and people would say, well, I just wanted to be a teacher just to be a teacher. And I'm like, how can you be a teacher just to be a teacher? There's so much that's happening there. There's so many things that are taking place. There's so many cultural elements that are taking place. And especially the people who were teaching the kids who look like me or the kids who were in the communities that I taught, it was not acceptable to just want to be a teacher. There was so much more at stake. We didn't want to be in a place where we were changing our students from their natural sort of way of existing. I don't want to use the word natural, their way of existing in the way in which they understand from their community to a way that we think was better. And so there is no neutral teaching. School has an effect on people, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what it's like to ensure that within the curriculum that we are not taking part in the culture killing ourselves. So Paulo Freire stated, in matters of racial inequality and bias, the educator has the duty of not being neutral. And so this presentation that we're about to do and that we're doing is not neutral. It's very unneutral. I don't even know if unneutral is a word, but it is now. It's very unneutral, and we're going to dig in a little bit more.
Absolutely. There's a professor named Dr. Karen Mapp in Boston, Massachusetts. And at this time, since George Floyd's death, it really sparked national outrage, and where we saw protests happening, in all 50 states, where people were almost kind of waking up to the idea of police brutality for communities that have been experiencing this since the beginning of policing in America. So as America began to wake up, and one thing that's been helping Americans wake up is there are a lot of anti-race books that have been written in the last 4 or 5 years to really help people come to terms with this idea of race and what does anti-racism look like in America. And they have been great. But what Karen Mapp does is she wrote an article, and basically the article was called The False Promise of Anti-Racism Books. She did not say don't read them. You should read them because it helps people grapple with identity. But her baseline in this essay or this article was, when the movement is all said and done, people are not going to ask you what you've read. They're going to ask you what you did. And so the idea is, as we look at all these books and we dive into this idea of anti-racism, we can run down the books that we've read, but it's all about what you do in this movement that makes it worthwhile. And so this whole PD is about how to do the work of anti-racism in the schools, even through the idea of curriculum. So very quickly, there are 3 different types of curriculum that are talked about. Like, if you've been to grad school and, in education, you're kind of familiar with this. So explicit curriculum is this idea of what are the core subjects that we basically teach. All right. And so English, math, science, social studies, that's the explicit curriculum. It's on their report card. We know that we teach that. But then there's a thing, if you jump, called the null curriculum. The null curriculum is literally what we do not teach. In our school at Freedom Prep in Memphis, we do not have driver's ed. So driver's ed is a part of our null curriculum. We do not teach it. But we're going to spend time talking about the implicit curriculum. The implicit curriculum is what is not said, but what is implied or what is assumed through what is said or not said. And this is when we talk about racism, when we talk about curriculum that is not culturally relevant, when we talk about curriculum that actually teaches the superiority of Western cultures to the inferiority of Black and brown people in this world, implicit curriculum is where it lays. So I'm gonna give you an example. If everybody looks at the chapters 1 through 6, right under implicit curriculum, it says chapter 1, Foundations of Civilization. Chapter 6 says Civilizations of the Americas. The title of this unit in a history book, this is directly from a history book. The title of the unit is Early Civilizations, Prehistory, so early man through AD 1570. If you look at chapter 1, there's one place, one location that should absolutely be mentioned by name in chapter 1 that is not mentioned. If you talk about where all humankind started, please type in the chat what should be mentioned by name in the title of chapter 1. I'll give you guys 5 seconds to go ahead and type that in the chat. Thank you. Thank you, Erica Roberts. Thank you. Thank you, Chase Patterson. I don't think it's probably Chase Patterson, but thank you, Africa. It should absolutely be mentioned. Why? Because in chapter 3, India and China are mentioned. Greece is definitely mentioned in chapter 4. In 5, ancient Rome. They even mentioned Christianity. And they mentioned Americans in 6. All humankind starts in Africa, and Africa is nowhere there mentioned by name in the titles. So how does this work implicitly? When you call the unit Early Civilizations, and the birthplace of all man and womankind is not even mentioned, then people automatically start to understand that Africa has no association with civilization. And so when the word Africa is taken out and missing, it becomes easier later on to think of civilization and advancements and never think of the continent called Africa. And it's interesting because you see in chapter 2, they mention a word. What word do they mention in chapter 2 that indicates Africa but doesn't say it?
Thank you. Type of fingers. There it is.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All these chases. Thank you. Like Middle East and Egypt. Now, the thing is this. We know geographically Egypt is an African country. And culture-wise, since its beginning, it has been an African culture. But if you look at all the movies that are done about Egypt, look at all the pictures about Egypt. It is very, very, Hollywood has already separated Egypt from Africa. And they've made every Egyptian from history light-skinned, white with a tan. And so it's very easy for people to look at Egypt and never think Africa, which is geographically inaccurate. But this is what implicit curriculum does. The classics, for all my ELA teachers, if you're ELA, let me hear you in the chat. I want to know who my ELA teachers are. ELA, go ahead and chat and let me know what your name is and tell me what grade you're teaching if you're teaching ELA. But ELA teachers, here's where the implicit curriculum shows up in ELA curriculum all across the country. We just say, we teach the classics. The classics, we teach the classics. And really what they mean by classics are, these are white Western books. And it's interesting, all right, Miss Petrillo, Miss White in first grade, when they say the classics, here's what the definition of the classics are. Since we use that word, I want us to be very explicit about what we're saying. When we say that we're teaching the classics, and these are all white texts, the classics means belonging to the highest class of citizens. So when we talk about how implicitly we are praising white culture and dehumanizing all Black and brown cultures around the world, we call them classics to show these white books, this is the highest class of citizen, and you are not a part of it. Or we say the canon. We also teach the canon. Well, if you want to look at the canon by turn, remember, we are breaking the implicit bias of implicit curriculum. So we have to really break these terms down. So when you say canon, here's what the canon means. It means the measuring rod or standard. Furthermore, it means Western intellectual tradition. So when you say, as an ELA teacher, I just teach the canon, that's all. I just teach the canon. I'm neutral. You're not being neutral. You are determining that Western intellectual tradition is the best tradition, and this is the measuring rod and the standard for which all other cultures should be measured. This is implicit in just the words classic and canon. Let's go to history. Where does implicit curriculum live? Well, this is called world history. Next slide. This is called world history. And if you just look, this looks innocent. World history units, unit 1 through 8, and there are 36 chapters overall called world history. But when you do this, you see that this is European and Western cultures. And so when you look at a world history book and you break it down, you realize this isn't world history at all. World history is really what they're teaching is European and Western history. And this is all the implicit. This is all the implicit bias that is found in implicit curriculum. Also, if you're like me, you heard about Hernan Cortez and Coronado and Pizarro and Cristobal Colon, or Christopher Columbus as we call them. We studied them. We know their names. And these are all explorers or murderers based on who you ask. But here's what I never learned. I never learned about the people who they conquered, the civilizations that they took over, the civilizations that they murdered. I know that these gentlemen spoke Spanish and Portuguese, and that's why these South American and Central American countries speak Spanish mostly. I don't know the languages that the people spoke who they conquered. And truthfully, if you look at my Central and South American students, I'm teaching the conquered people. And it's interesting when I'm sitting there teaching them about the greatness of their conquerors. This is what implicit curriculum does. Next, and this is the last example, I believe. If you look at this, let's just look at the first textbook cover. These are all history textbooks. And remember, implicit curriculum is not hard to find if you know what you're looking for. If you know what you're looking for. So if you look at this first one, and only my history teachers would kind of know this. If you look at that very first one, it says Herodotus Histories. And then it shows a picture of the Sphinx. We all know that the Sphinx is one of the wonders of the world, sitting in, once again, what country? The country of Egypt, Egypt and Africa. But Herodotus, the name on top of it is a Greek. And so here implicitly, they are showing you Greek names, and it's called Greek histories, Herodotus histories, and showing you African accomplishments. And they're literally giving the Greeks the advancements that were not their own. And this is a history book. This is a textbook. And so there is no such thing as being neutral as a teacher. If you only teach your kids what is taught to us, and was taught to you in school, we are absolutely dehumanizing our students of color by teaching incorrect histories and incorrect information.
And so just to sort of restate this again, right? The implicit curriculum being the things that you don't say are there. And the reason why this is extremely important in terms of talking about the killing of culture or the way that we are teaching is that implicit curriculum allows a lot of times educators to get away with just teaching the same old thing and acting like they are not doing anything wrong. No, this is what was in the curriculum. There's no problem. This is what was there. No issue, right? And it's fine, right? But there is always subtle things happening, right, in terms of what it is that we're teaching. So, for instance, you look at all of these Roman gods who somehow are sitting on top of clouds, right? Pluton, you got Marte, you have Jupiter, you have Neptuno, Venus, Mercurio. What do all of those names sound like? And I meant to say this in the very beginning. Y'all, this is very weird for us doing this PD over Zoom and doing PD like this. It is so weird.
Can't see.
We can't see people. And we're like, hey, what do you got to think? What do you think? And people are like, I got to type it in. And so it's very weird for us. So try your best. And well, one, we're going to try our best to make sure it's as engaging as possible. The second thing is, in terms of engagement, if you want to write in the chat a lot, if you want to amen in the chat, do all of that, because that's helpful for us in terms of knowing what you're receiving. And so again, I'll ask again, Pluton, Neptuno, Mercurio, what do those all sound like? And I'll give a few seconds. Oh, chat, somebody popping up. Planet. K. Chase Patterson is off the chain. He answers all the questions, and it may be, I don't know how. But yes, planets. And Cheyenne Lewis, yes, planets, right? These are all planets. Here's the ironic thing. How many times have we talked about Romans discovering all the planets? This is not something that is true within history, Romans discovering planets. Yet they were given the names of the planets, right? Luna, which is the Greek goddess. And we even have, when we were referring to the cycle of the moon, we refer to it as the lunar cycle, right? And the different moons, all the different moons in the moon system is often referred to as lunar. This was named after the Greek goddess Luna. The Greeks did not discover multiple moons. In many European cultures, it was very difficult for them to discover these things because of the sort of way that they saw the world, right? Yet, our system in terms of moons and names of moons is given to the Greeks, right? The International Astronomical Union established this in 1919, the naming of the planets, and their mission was to promote and safeguard the science of astronomy in all its aspects through international cooperation. See that they said that the very implicit thing, and they were going to do it through international cooperation, yet all the planets are named after Rome, or with Roman names. And so it wasn't very international in terms of the naming, but this is what they are saying in the mission is the case, right? And so this is the things we're having to look out for and watch out for.
So there was a great question, and I hope that I understood it correctly when it was asked, but someone asked the question, where are our canons? And so perfect question. And the answer is, if you are going to, once again, if you are going to look at the intelligentsia of other cultures, especially of the Black and the brown students that you teach, we got to step out of white Western canon or text to understand more about the world, because the world is bigger than what our textbooks have given us. And so I will not say this is the perfect book, but I will give you a lot of great authors that we read in order to expand our mind when we're teaching math, science, history, and ELA. And so first, when we talk about the earliest man, when we talk about earliest man and woman, when we talk about the prehistory, I go to these. These are my anthropologists, Egyptologists, and historians. Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop, Dr. Joseph Benyaka, and Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, Henry Clark. And the only one that's still alive out of the group is Dana Marnici. And she is amazing. These are people who have explained and they've done extensive jobs in explaining the history of Africa before we ever start talking about slavery. Before we're talking about that, they live and talk about BC. They talk about the earliest civilizations, the civilizations that are left out of books. And I have a bunch of white inspirations that I go to. And when it comes to white educators who speak truth to power about this issue of race, these are people I go to. Tim Wise is amongst my favorite.
And I'm leaving it up just for a second, Mike, just in case people want to write down some of these people.
If you want to take a picture, please do that, because when you walk away and you want to read books, if you start with any of the books that these authors have written, I promise you it will not be wasted time. This is how you get new knowledge and teach more culturally relevant curriculum. For my Asian American inspirations, these are some of my go-tos.
The first one is Paul Yoon.
Sorry, his name is cut off.
Paul Yoon.
My brown skin inspirations.
4, 3, 2, and 1.
And some of my just academic. These are some of the people who are doing the work, but they're also doing it through the lens of education, very specifically.
And moving forward.
So when you talk about who's my canon, I get my canon from them.
So let's talk a little bit more too about implicit curriculum, right? And ways, oftentimes when we think about sort of shifting these things, we think we have to make something up. Or I don't remember who said this quote, Mike, you might remember, but when they talked about, they said, we don't want to trade one chauvinism for another form of chauvinism. Right. I don't remember who it was that said the quote, and I'm probably butchering it a little bit.
I think it was Dr. Asa Hilliard.
There we go. And so if you look up Dr. Asa Hilliard and put something like I said, because I butchered a little bit, then you'll find that, right? But here's the thing. When it comes to the curriculum and implicit curriculum, we don't have to make up stuff. There's actual true history that deals with the accomplishment of the people, of the students, right? Their ancestors, the people who look like them. There are things that came from those people. And so I'm going to read a few of those things as well. So chemistry, right? Which we call chemistry, and the way it's spelled gives you an idea that's a little different than where it came from. But chemistry is Comitian science or Chemitan science, and originally called alchemia, which meant black art. Algebra is actually aljabar, which means the reunion of broken pieces, right? And so when you think about algebra, if you knew it was aljabar, then your attachment to it in terms of it being a Eurocentric idea would be a lot different, right? Moving forward, Isaac Newton expressed that Africans were advanced in the theory of heliocentrism, while Greek scholars credited with the idea were at the time geocentric. I want you to think about this. The reason, this whole flat earth thing that's coming back now from some people who are oftentimes intellectual contrarians, right, was something that was a very big thing when it came to European intellectuals at one time. We all learned that the Europeans thought the earth was flat. While we were learning that the Europeans thought the earth was flat, we were not learning what other people thought about the earth. The reality is our ancestors and the ancestors of most of your students who you serve, they believe that the earth was an oval or was a circle, right? Or was a sphere. And they were heliocentric, which meant that they believed that the planets were revolving around the sun, not that everything revolved around the earth, right? Very different. We learn European mistakes before we learn African accomplishments. Also, the idea of no written language in Africa is false. They had the Mande script, the Proto-Saharan script, the Akan script, the Meroitic script, the hieroglyph, Kemetic Hieratic, and Demotic Thinite script, Wadi script, etc. And I'm sure there's much, much more that we don't have here. But the reason why this becomes an extremely important sort of idea is that when you say that these African people did not write, that they did not have the ability to write, then you create an idea where they were not intellectually capable of doing this, right? And the reality is there were multiple scripts that different African civilizations had.
And those African scripts are all BC scripts.
Thank you for sharing that.
All scripts before what we now consider or call the Roman script or our English lettering. Beautiful.
And last, think about when I read this quote, think about like Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, Archimedes. If you were to write a book of 1,000 pages, you could not put down names of all Greeks who went to Nile Valley in ancient Egypt to study, written by Saint Clement of Alexandria. Also, Let me move my screen a little bit. So place value and the concept of zero are two advanced features that the Mayan number system by 34 BC shared with our modern Arabic notation. But the Mayan numbers use a vigesimal-based system of 20 rather than of 10, right? And so if we're dealing, a lot of our students sometimes may be students of Spanish-speaking descent, right? Mexican-American students is our population of students that we have that is starting to grow. We can also talk about the advancements of their people as well. Indigenous Central Americans calculated the solar year to be 365 point, math teacher, I don't know what this is, 242036. I was an English teacher, 8th grade, days, which is very close to actual length of 365.2422 days. And they built their cities around astronomical observatories called E-groups. And even the wording that's put here, they built them around astronomical observatories. Most time people say they built them in a way so they could look at the stars. Now, these are people who are astronomers, and this is why they were building their cities in that way. Last but not least, more than 120 drugs prescribed by world physicians today are derivatives from plants discovered and used by Southwest and South American native physicians. Right? These are people who understood the way the body was working and how to heal it in the best way. These are some of the things that our students who their ancestors were doing.
And Mr. Salaam, what do people call, like, whenever we talk about indigenous Americans and we talk about, like, we don't call them doctors and physicians.
Yeah.
Like, somebody could type in the chat, what do we call Native American or indigenous people who are good with just healing? We don't never call them physicians. We never call them botanists. We never call them scientists. But what are some of the implicit names? Witch doctors. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Mike.
No, go ahead.
No, I was going to share this, and I was like, let me not share it, right? But absolutely, right. And there is also an implicit understanding of what it means to be a witch doctor, because they've also put in our face witch doctors, how they look, that they are doing things from sort of a spooky sort of place, not that they actually understood nature, that they understood the plants, that they understood these things, that they tested them out, that they experimented. They are what we would currently call modern day scientists. And the reason I'm saying it that way is that I don't want to negate the terminology that some of those people were using, which they weren't using witch doctor, right? But shaman. I don't want to negate those terms, but I want us to understand what shamans are. What they were at that time period. They were what we would today call currently doctors or physicians. This is the knowledge base that they carried and that they had.
So we talk about racism. Racism doesn't sit like, because remember, people are more and cultures are more afraid of being called racist than being racist. And so we have to understand it is so easy to look at someone who's carrying, a Nazi symbol and to say they're racist and to say, look at those people over there. What we are more interested in addressing is how racism really, really comes in our schools through implicit curriculum, teaching the dehumanization of some races at the expense of elevating others. And so this is the area that we live in. So now we're going to look at, for the last half hour, what does this look like in your lessons? Now that you're able to call these things out and that you're able to see them. Somebody said, let's not even bring up the whole religion. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Chase is on point again.
Oh gosh, Chase is all over the place. I don't even want to get it started, but yeah, I won't even go there. But the idea of talking about if we to see in history how history books write out Native American rituals, it sounds weird, but yet when we talk about Christian rituals, it sounds so spiritual and so clean. Like, in other words, if we were to write about Christian religion the same way we do about indigenous religions, we would talk about one day a month, we go to a place and we get together and we drink the blood and we say chants and we drink the blood of somebody who we think died and we think that we become them because we take their blood, and that's called communion. But that's how they explain Native American religions and what they're doing. But when it comes to Christianity, we just say we're taking community, we're sharing the body and blood of our Savior. Sounds nice. So just even the way we explain these religious differences is a problem and implicit in practice. So now when it comes to cultural connection strategies, I want to give you guys 6 strategies, and that's a lot to learn, so you don't have to learn all of them. But here are 6 ways to actually turn your daily lessons into more culturally relevant and culturally empowering lessons. Number 1, and these are I'm sorry. And these are going in order from easiest to most to most thoughtful and most difficult. All right. So be honest about where you are and what you want to get. So number one, the first strategy is select culturally relevant or empowering text. That is a great strategy. Now, a number of us do that. They say, you know, I'm gonna swap this text out for this text. This text looks like my students, this text goes more in depth, you know, but what our students do it and they can connect, that is a great cultural connection. That is level one. The second level is problem solving for real world issues affecting students. So when you're able to look at your lessons and you're able to make real world connections, that is another level of rigor when it comes to cultural connections. Level three, renaming for historical accuracy. So when you start to realize that, man, this is not exactly as the book explains, you can even start to change the name. So when you realize that these North and Eastern Africans they had names for all these stars that they identified, or names after all the moons, and then you realize that they were named after Roman gods, you can start to give them North African names just to rename and just to understand the real history of it. So that's level three. Level four is do nouns for cultural context. So when you're taking the first 10 to 15 minutes of your class where you're assessing prior knowledge before you get into new knowledge, that is a great chance to take a cultural moment to put your lessons and the standards that kids are learning into cultural perspective. Number five, recreating your text for cultural accuracy. That is different and that is difficult. That is, I see what the text that the curriculum gives me, but now I am reading these 5 different books and I'm going to synthesize and take all this information and I'm going to recreate a text that is palatable to my students, but brings in that brings in the knowledge of these historians rather than this culturally irrelevant or culturally inaccurate text. That takes a lot of time. I promise you, I spent most of my first 3 years of teaching doing that, and that's why it took me all night to lesson plan. So that's a hard one, but sometimes a very necessary one. And number 6, reworking objectives to include real-world connection or cultural connections. When you get so good at this that you're able to look at the state standards, look at the objectives in the curriculum and say, now I'm going to switch the objective because I have new text and new information, that is to me the highest level of making culturally relevant lessons. And so right now in the chat, I would just love for you all to look at those 6 things. Remember, from easiest to most difficult, and be honest with yourself. Be honest with yourself. If you're doing any of these, you are right where you should be. So right now, I want you to type in, which have you implemented? And you can do number 1, 2, 3 if you've implemented 1, 2, and 3. So type in those numbers and then do a dash and type in the last answer is, which would you like to have a greater impact on? Which would you like to do better? So type in all the numbers that you do and then type a dash and show the one that you want to get better at.
And one other thing, again, for those attendees, if you hover over your name and click on the thing that says more and go to rename, then you can change your name so we can know who you actually are and we don't think you're Curry or you're Chase Patterson. There's a million Chase Pattersons in the room. And so if you could just hover over your name, push the more button, rename, and then you can name yourself.
All right. All right, good. Thank y'all. Thank y'all. Thank y'all. I'm seeing a lot of people doing 1, doing 2, some people doing 3, a lot of people went to learn them 6. Excellent job. All right, let's advance. Okay. All right, so we're going to give you some very, very specific examples. And my math people, if you're math, you get to go first. And so this is exactly what it would look like if we were doing this in math class, to bring all those different authors that we showed you, but to know that we're teaching math. And people say, well, I'm just dealing with numbers, so I'm not dealing with culture. You are. You are, and we'll show you exactly what that looks like. Here's an example of what it looks like to have culturally relevant curriculum.
So according to Iamblichus, Pythagoras spent 22 years studying in the Egyptian temples, where he was taught astronomy, geometry, spirituality, and was immersed in the Egyptian mysteries. Here in Egypt, he frequented all the temples with the greatest diligence and studious research. Pythagorean Theorem, which claims that any A angle, the square of the B, is equal to the C of the squares of the other side, has been attributed to Pythagoras. However, this theorem was long known to the ancient Egyptians and is in fact incorporated in the construction of the Great Pyramids. The surviving Rhine mathematical papyrus dating back to about 1832 BC reveals the deep mathematical knowledge of the ancient Egyptians. Knowledge of the Pythagorean theorem is also said to have been known in other cultures such as in India, China, and Babylon, Iraq. Reading of works by Egyptologists such as Albert Churchward reveals that this theorem has an ancient source, Africa.
All right. And so, of course, that's a picture of Pythagoras. And because I know that we are teaching things that were not in standard textbooks, we're putting the source of all these different things. And these are much older sources. And so in case you ever want to look at it, or if you're like, I don't believe it, here are the sources. All right, you can advance. So here's what I want you to consider. So here's a scenario after reading that. Yesterday was spent teaching students the procedural application of the Pythagorean theorem. So this is you as a math teacher. The next day's do now can be used to create a cultural connection. You have 15 minutes in today's class period to create a strong culturally empowering lesson simply by creating a thoughtful do now. I want you to think right now for the next 3 minutes, what are the main points you want students to learn or take away from the reading about this theorem? So remember, on Monday, you taught the Pythagorean theorem. They know the angles, they know how to do it, they know how to plug it in, but they don't know anything else about it. Tuesday, the first 10 minutes of class, this is the reading that you give them. So now, based on what you want them to take away from it, about the theorem, about African people, or about math in general, I want you to create, I'm saying 3 to 5 questions to accompany this short text as a do now. So you're right now creating a do now. You don't have to do 3 to 5 sentences. Give me 1 or 2 good questions and type them in the chat. What are 1 or 2 questions that you would ask based on that do now reading? And this is what kids will be doing the first 15 minutes the day after they learn the Pythagorean theorem. And Salaam will switch back so that you can see the text. I will give you guys, I'll put 3 minutes on the clock. Right now, it's for you 4:10. At 4:13, we'll start to read some of the answers. Please go ahead and try to create 2 do now questions according to this reading. Who will be the first brave soul to type in 1 or 2 questions? Salaam, my bet is going to be that it's Chase. What's your bet?
You know what? I'm thinking it's Kari, actually. That's who I'm betting on, Kari. And if anyone needs me to go up,
who won? Chase.
Chase.
Very good. Very good.
They are anonymous.
Take risks. Take risks. Take risks.
That's the real Kari, I believe, that said that. I see. I assume that after people were telling me they couldn't change their name. Yeah. Okay.
I keep going. Create your 1 or 2 questions that you would ask using this text. Remember, you're not teaching. You are just, students are reading this silently, and you're giving them a few questions that they would answer that would help check their understanding of the cultural context of the Pythagorean theorem. Very good. I want to pronounce the name correct. Garti. If I mispronounce it, I'm so sorry. Excellent question. Excellent do now question.
Beautiful.
Yes.
Luann.
Luann.
It's Garte.
Garte. Thank you. Garte. Thank you. Thank you. Luann. Thank you. Excellent question. We have about 30 more seconds. 30 more seconds. We'd love to see some more questions.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Mm-hmm. All right, take 5 more seconds. All right. Excellent, excellent. So those questions would help, those are the questions that students would ask or answer for you to understand that they are understanding and getting a more cultural context of the Pythagorean theorem. Excellent job. There are also, you can advance the slide, and these are some of the questions that I would ask. So number one, once again, I would have them fill in the A, B, and C letters, because if you told them the procedural part yesterday, then they know this. But number two, on what document could the original works of the Pythagorean theorem be found? Number three, explain the time discrepancy between Pythagoras and the original theorem. So once again, it even gives them that idea of, man, the Pythagorean theorem has been around for a long time before Pythagoras was ever born. Name 3 other civilizations that applied the theorem, which somebody was kind of asking. And the last one, this is a kind of a creative one. The last one is, with more historical accuracy, what would you name the theorem? So knowing that Pythagoras learned the theorem when he was studying there for 22 or 23 years and not creating the theorem, what would you name it to be more historically accurate? So those are just some questions that I could possibly ask them to do now to make sure that kids walked away and had a more understanding, a historical aspect and understanding of the Pythagorean theorem.
And Mike, I just want to reiterate that in terms of Pythagoras, and the reason that this is important in terms of implicit curriculum is that Pythagoras in his theory, and Pythagoras was a Greek philosopher, Pythagoras and his theorem could not have been created by him, right? The most perfect triangles that we've ever seen have been in Egypt, and other places where they've created pyramids, right? But the point is that if they created what the Pythagorean theorem was supposed to be a theory to apply, they had the application actually of the theory already, right? And so that last question is so important to me, Mike, because it's like, well, what else would you call it now that you know that Pythagoras did not come up with it himself?
Yes. And can you highlight the answer to number 3, please?
Yes.
So if you want to know the time discrepancy between the time that they were building the pyramids and Pythagoras was born, the difference is 1,262 years. So we promise he did not create it. It was on the Rhine papyrus. All right. Thank you. And we can advance. So Dr. Rochelle Gutierrez, she had a statement. Salaam, if you could read the statement for us.
Sure. She said, think that math is just math? Well, you're wrong. Math might as well be called white math because curricula emphasizing terms like Pythagorean theorem and pi perpetuate a perception that mathematics was largely developed by Greeks and other Europeans.
All right. All right. And we're going to move. And so you guys got some other information to even take her example a little deeper.
Yep.
Next.
All right. Sorry, I need to mute the cough real quick. So just wanted to read this quote that continues to make that point. By calling the theorem of the square of the hypotenuse to Pythagorean theorem, it has concealed the truth for centuries from the world, who ought to know that the Egyptians taught Pythagoras and the Greeks with mathematics they know. George M. James' book, Stolen Legacy.
And if you want to know, like, when you call, like, what is a classic for us, G.M. James and Stolen Legacy is a classic. And I just want to make this point also. When we say Egypt, I know that people are thinking about the corner country that has been carved out in the last, few years. But when they're talking about Egypt, and if you ask like the ancient Egyptians, when they talk about Egypt and they talk about where they got the information from, Egypt is not just a corner country in Africa that they're talking about now. When we say Egypt, we're talking about Ethiopia, we're talking about Eritrea, we're talking about Kenya, we're talking about Sudan, we're talking about the Democratic Republic of Congo. All that was considered Egypt when they were talking about, so not the corner country that we're talking about now. So I just want to make that clear. All right, so looking at the math example that we just gave, and we'll give another example that will be social studies facing. But the example that we just gave, there were a few strategies that were on our original list that were just used in that activity. Please go ahead and chat all the strategies that apply. Which strategies were just used in that math activity? Shirley, you are absolutely right.
Yeah.
gotta tell you, one was used. Very good. Selecting culturally relevant text. That's Luann. Excellent job. Number 3, renaming for historical accuracy. That was used. Excellent job. Number 4, the do nows for cultural context. Once again, number 3. So this is how you look at these 6 different strategies. And I don't want you to think that if you say I'm only going to use I'm going to do strategy 1, that you can only use strategy 1. You can use multiple strategies in one lesson, and you probably will. So I want you guys to be able to identify. So excellent job. I think in the last 13 minutes we have time for one more.
12 minutes.
So let's go strong. Let's go to the last one. We just want to give this example really quickly. Can you go back to the text really quickly, Salaam?
Okay.
For that one, we're not going to explain this, but this is about Pythagoras. But it's a whole different text from different authors that we pulled together if our students were mostly Latino or Spanish-speaking students. So remember, you teach to your students because you're teaching your students most importantly. So the most important thing is that you connect with the people that you're teaching. So if most of your students are Spanish-speaking students, yes, in the first paragraph here, it mentions that it has its roots in Egypt. But the rest of this text talks about what they were doing in Mexico and Guatemala and El Salvador and Belize and Honduras and how they applied similar things. And very, very quickly, the great thing about this was they looked at numbers as having meaning. Salaam, can you give an example quickly of how they looked at it?
Yeah. So, for instance, in our own culture, we have where if I said today was Friday the 13th, then some of us may feel a certain way. Or if you go into an elevator, you will not see the 13th floor. They stopped putting 13th floor on elevators because of the symbol, what 13 as a number symbolizes to us. It doesn't just symbolize 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. The 13 as a number has a symbol that is associated with it. 7 as a number has a symbol that is associated with it. 3 as a number has a symbol that's associated with it. So it's not just about the notation and the quantitative fact of the number, but also there's something a little bit more qualitative, and that was something that was done in a lot of these ancient cultures. All right, we'll move past this one.
Yep, and we'll get to our last one. So this is a history example. And on Friday, we're going to give you guys science examples. So I'm looking forward to that. So for this one, for all my history teachers, here you go. The objective, the students will be able to describe how the economic needs of Americans in the mid-1800s were met by the government through the Homestead Act of 1862. All of my U.S. history teachers know that the Homestead Act is one of the standards that you got to talk about. The interesting thing is you look at the objective, and the first question is, the government met America's needs in the 1800s? When I look at where my people were in the mid-1800s, we weren't in a place where government were meeting needs, we were actually enslaved. And so just understand that once again, when they talk about the culture, they talk about somebody's culture, just not mine. But that's the objective that's given. So in this, I want you to consider the rigor level, the text and objective. So look at the rigor level right now of this objective. Describe. All right, can you advance the slide? Mm-hmm. So if you look at Bloom's taxonomy, where is the described level in Bloom's taxonomy? Based on the standard that was given in the curriculum. Very good, except for remembering. Right. So we're already at the bottom of the Bloom's taxonomy pyramid. We are on the lowest level of understanding. So it's already a low lift, all right? And so whenever we do culturally relevant curriculum, we not only want to make sure that our kids' culture is represented, but we also want to push the mastery level and the intellectual rigor level of it. So let's advance. Yeah. So this is, once again, if we, no such thing as a neutral teacher. If we just teach what the history book gave us, this is directly from the text about the Homestead Act.
So the Homestead Act of 1862 in the textbook, signed into law by President Abraham Lincoln on May 20th, 1862, the Homestead Act provided American citizens with 160 acres of public land per family, American citizens. As a minimal requirement, homesteaders paid a small filing fee and had to complete 5 years of continuous residence before receiving legal ownership of the free land, with the option to purchase early for $1.25 per acre. This was the most comprehensive land distribution bill passed in the 19th century and ambitiously shifted land ownership towards average American citizens.
Just sit with that for a second. Just sit with that for a second.
Average American citizens, sir.
Who was the average American citizen? If they shifted land to them, who was the average? Who was the average American citizen that deserved this land? That exactly. It was not us. And it's interesting because if this was done today, for one, they would call this welfare.
Mm-hmm.
They would call this welfare. But when it was given to white Americans, it was never called welfare. It was just called the Homestead Act. It was not called the Freebie. It was called the Homestead Act. And it was
legislation that was made. Yeah.
And they never had to say white on it.
No.
They said average, shipped it to the white, to the average American. And just so that we're clear, because we're about to hit Black History Month, the people start talking about Abraham Lincoln. Don't use him as Black History Month because this passed under him. This was his bill. This was his bill. So while he is like, we can no longer hold African Americans as slaves, let's let them go. But before we let them go, let's make sure that we give white people all the land that they need so that while white people might become legally the same level as Black people, they will always economically be ahead. And it was never called welfare. This is implicit. So I cannot give this to my students. I'm teaching Black and Latino students. I cannot give this to them. So let's advance. So here are the questions that I ask myself when I'm making a culturally relevant lesson. I say, how is this topic connected to the students I serve? How did this event or concept affect the students or the community that I serve? How can this topic heal, build, or advance the goals of our students in their community? Last but not least, how can I increase the rigor and to advance? So if I have Latino students mostly, this is the text that from other information, from those other authors, this is how the Homestead Act affected them. And this would be the text that I give to my Latino students, which still teaches them about the Homestead Act, but puts them in the center of it rather than an additional or an add-on.
The Homestead Act of 1862 granted 270 million acres of land to white Americans, which included European immigrants who were not yet citizens, for free. Every acre of this land was forcibly acquired from Mexican and Native American families. More than half of those removed were already U.S. citizens under the new laws. When they fought in the U.S. courts to keep their homes, the expensive legal processes for each case were strategically extended to render the Mexican and Native plaintiffs penniless for their efforts. While the millions of Native families affected still suffered the economic loss of their land, 40 million direct descendants of homesteaders either still live on the land, pass it down through the family, or have sold the land, rolling over the profit into other homes and businesses, thus creating today's middle class. Wow.
So today's middle class was not created just through like people working hard, because hard work does not belong to one culture of people. Hard work is a story that people across all races in this country have done. But why we have the haves and the have-nots based on racial lines is through legislation. The legislation creates today's middle class, not hard work and effort. Not hard work and effort.
Absolutely.
And we want our Latino students who see their families working all day and all night, working hard, to understand the reason why your family does not have all the things that America says they should have by working hard is not because of anything wrong that your families have done. It's because of legislation, unequal legislation. And if we're not going to teach this in school, then what are we spending our time teaching students? So if you want to learn how to be a revolutionary teacher, it's cool to say revolutionary. Are you willing to change your curriculum to do it? It's cool to say you're an activist. It's cool to say you're an ally. Are you so much of an activist and an ally that you're willing to spend that extra hour doing lesson planning to make sure that your students see the truth in who they are, even in your curriculum? Remember, no one will care about what you read. They'll only care about what you did. This is your moment to make a difference in your classroom. If you're teaching traditionally African-American students, here's the text that I would give them. And this will be the last reading. Thank you, Salaam.
Absolutely. The Homestead Act of 1862 granted 270 million acres of land to white Americans, which included European immigrants who were not yet citizens, across the country with virtually no down payment, legally disqualifying the booming Chinese working population, the Native Americans from which the land was forcefully acquired just years prior, and African Americans who as a people had been in America for over 300 years already. 40 million direct descendants of those homesteaders still live on the land, pass it down to the family, or have sold the land, rolling over the profit into other homes and businesses, thus creating today's middle class.
So once again, the idea of putting culturally relevant curriculum, it's always, you can advance the slide, it's
True.
always about looking at your students first and seeing who they are, and then putting them in the center of your text. You have these standards, but you also have who your kids are. Bring those together, and that's how you create your culturally relevant lesson. So this is what I would do. So this is the objective that was given. And for the sake of time, this is the new objective. If I take the new text, this is the objective that I would change it to. So we go from describe how the economic needs of Americans in the mid-1800s were met to evaluate the long-term effects of race-based poverty in the U.S. as a result of the Homestead Act in 1862. And if you just look at the words of rigor, so in the first objective, objective A is describe. In objective B, it's evaluate. Can you advance the slide and let's see where evaluate is on Bloom's taxonomy when it comes to rigor? Where is evaluate? All right, so it's in the evaluation in the top level. So we also increase the rigor of it. Excellent job. Thank you, Garth.
Wow.
All right, you can advance.
All right.
Okay. And once again, these are the strategies that we're pulling from and that we're using. And so in this one, we use number 1. We did some number 2 because we talked about economic development. We did number 5. We recreated the text, and that was the heavy one. All right, and we did number 6, which is the hardest one. We even reworked the objective to include the real world and cultural connection. And so right now it is time to end. If there are any last minute questions, please go ahead and type them in the chat. I so appreciate your time. And this was a lot. And I'm excited about the opportunity to share with you guys also on Friday. Mr. Salaam, you have anything to say?
No, just thank you. And I think you ended out so well that only thing that needs to happen is the choir needs to say amen. Or if you have an indigenous African persuasion, you can say Ashe.
Hey, I just want to say thank both of you guys, Brother Salaam, Brother Brown.